questions, because I'm sure you'll have some, or observations, or all of those things. Is there somebody that got my Holt family one off this table? Because I don't have one.
Uh-oh.
Thank you, I'll give it back later. If you'd like to find the one that's got the maps on it, we'll take a overview with the map first. If you look on the back side of it, that's the oldest one. This is something that when Gary Brown was on our history group, he made this. And these are all the people that bought land from the government in what section they bought, and sometimes what year they did it in. This corner up here wasn't sold. It was called Canal Trustee Lands, but originally that was the one that they would sell the land and pay for the schools that were built to start with for the whole township. And they held up the price. The canal was the one that goes from Chicago down to the Illinois River, and they were raising money, but what they did was these were sold at auction at higher prices, because normally when you bought it from the government it was $1.25 an acre in cash. You had to pay for it right there. And so, you know, later homesteading meant they bet you couldn't stay there, but they let you have the land for nothing as long as you stayed. Was it 5 years? It wasn't too much. Okay, so each of these families that are marked on the bottom are yours colored too?
Yeah.
Okay, so we'll start with Holt. If you look at the blue ones in the bottom corner, that's where they originally bought land. There's Elijah Holt, and that's on Montague, and that's where the original house still stands. It was built in 1840. It's in part of the Severson Dells property. It's deteriorating and it may not last much longer. Then the other Holt, there were right here above, William, or originally his name was Williams Holt. And then that one had a descendant until I think the 1970s. We'll mention it when we talk about family. Okay. Hudson is the one, it's got two pieces. One of them is at Westfield Corners at the bottom. That was Duty Hudson. And he was the one when they had the stagecoach that went out Montague Road. He had a tavern that people could stop at, Buckhorn Tavern. And so it's one of the oldest things. It's actually in the house that Bakey's used to live in. It doesn't look.
John, I presently live in that house.
Oh, okay.
The tavern is not open.
And then there was, over on the west edge, there was Horace Holt. And there were three brothers, and I'll get into that a little later. Okay? Then we have Merrifields, and Merrifields had all these in the center, the red ones. It's hard to tell one red from the other, but but little by little they moved away until there was only one Merrifield farm left that most of us remember. Then there was Schoonmakers, and originally they were these two pieces right here. That's what Henry Schoonmaker claimed as a preemption, which meant he didn't have to buy it. Somebody had served in the military and if you came out and claimed it, you could have it from the government. And then later, they also got some down Osborne Road, and those were basically woodlots. Because only about this much of the township, the bottom part, had woods on it. The rest up above was prairie. So if you wanted to build a house, that was a distinct problem, but sometimes the prairie land turned out to be richer than the other. And so, you know, it all depended on who got here first, because the bottom section was what was settled first. Okay, and then Weldon's, originally the old house that Mr. Weldon can show us later, a picture, Jonathan Weldon came from, the others mostly came from New York State, but he was born in Massachusetts and his wife was born in Maine. And they arrived here in a 2-year trip because they were crippled and they had a wagon that was set up so that they could run it. Okay, if you look inside, there are more of the same things and you can get a little idea. This one was 1859 and it was a wall map, and that's why we don't have a good copy of it, because it used to be on oilcloth hung on the wall, and so we didn't get very good copies. If you look in the inside, there are, see, I followed the same color scheme all the way through. So most of the families are still represented in 1871 and 1886. But gradually, certain families moved away. The Merrifields, most of those families went out west, some of them to California. Did that raise any questions?
Weldon, that's the apartment Weldon Road there, the Red House?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Yeah, you know the history, some more history behind that house?
We'll do some
Get into
more.
that, okay.
Okay, if you want to turn to the Holt family, we'll start with the first one. I made notes, so I better use them. See, we were discussing up here how long ago this is. I had ancestors in my dad's family that came to Guilford Township, you know, East Rockford now. And the wife came in 1838, she was a teenager. And the man came with 2 friends from New York State, and he arrived in 1841. And they were my great-great-grandparents. So, and Jim says that's how far Henry is from him in generations. So it's a long time ago, like 150 years, getting there. Okay, the Holts, there were 3 brothers, and they got to Winnebago from New York State in 1837. And each one had a family that stayed around here at least for a while. David Adams was one brother. And then there was William, or Williams, and he had a son named Leonard who was a Methodist minister here and elsewhere. And that one had a son named Harlow, who was another Methodist minister who served in this whole area. And over there you'll find an album on the table that a man and lady brought here this summer. And there are lots of pictures in there of Harlow and his wife, because his wife was a Morse, and they were from Winnebago and got married. And then they moved west, Colorado, I think, but the couple that came here and brought all these reproduced beautiful pictures, they're well labeled too. They're from Northern California. William or Williams Holt had a son named Elijah Henry, and that man had a son named Curly Holt. Maybe you've heard that name. And he and his wife had one daughter, Eleanor Holt, who was married to Elmer Johnson. And she died in 1982, age 77, on the same farm site, which is kitty corner from the Weldon School on the southwest side. It doesn't look like that anymore because when it was sold, they took down the old house and the old barn business and built new buildings, so it doesn't look like an old site, but it was the same spot. And then there was Deacon Elijah, and he was the one who had the oldest house on Montague Road. His wife was Mary Treadwell, and she was the first teacher in this township. And she continued to teach for some years. When they finally built a building, she taught in her own house, I think, for a while. And then eventually they built the Westfield School at the Westfield Corners, and that's what they used. Does any of that raise any?
Where's the Weldon School?
Weldon School is at the corner of Weldon Road and Edwardsville. And the Weldon Farm is the big one with the red buildings just north of there.
It's not converted to a house, not be to build.
Yes, somebody lives in the old school, that's right. It was one of the last one-room schools that were used, but for a very short time, the Centerville district and the Weldon district were together. And they had certain grades at Centerville and other ones were bused over to Weldon School to keep going.
Are you saying that white house there is the Weldon School?
On the corner.
So that house is that old?
Well, it was rebuilt sometime. I can't tell you when exactly, but it was the same district and the same location the whole time.
Oh, okay.
See, we had 8 or 9 one-room schools scattered across the whole. That would be another nice topic to cover sometime. But then they were, the consolidation started from Winnebago, because Winnebago was just one of the 9 to start with. And then they consolidated with the one that used to be just west of the corners out here. It was called Nicholson. It's where the Dinner Dell was, the little restaurant there, that site. Because that scattered out, you know, in terms of 3 and 3 and 3. Several other buildings still exist. The old white school on Osborne Road is occupied by the Schroeder family, and that's still there. Okay, shall we go on to Hudson's and then we'll take a break after that?
Do you want a place? Do you want to have a seat here?
Okay, this sounds like an old story,
Just gonna take a break
but
pretty soon. I'll stretch my legs.
the Hudsons were 3 brothers too. it was often true that just one family didn't come by themselves. They came in groups, and it was always easier, and you didn't fight so much if you were all related. Like so, the Hudsons arrived from Rhode Island, and they came to Illinois in about 1839. And as I said, from the maps, Duty Hudson set up the tavern just east of Westfield Corners, because that was the first community that actually functioned as a community, just because that's where the first settlement was made. And it was wooded there.
That's where the stagecoach was.
And you know, it had a store, and so merchants had it, you know, so it didn't change a lot. No, that was from all. Okay, Duty Hudson was also, he was a Methodist, and that building that the township has now, and was the community club and earlier the Grange, that was the Methodist chapel. It was built in the 1850s. It doesn't look like it, but it was. And when the, eventually it went with the property. There was a barn and a house there at one time on that corner. And the lady that survived there ended up owning that chapel when it wasn't used anymore. And when she died, she left it to the community. And so that was available, and it's basically been a community building ever since. The farmland didn't go with it, you know, that was sold, and Mandeville's farmed the land there. And eventually, I read that, well, Duty Hudson was also the first postmaster in Winnebago because, you know, that was the community center at the time.
So you're saying the Grange Hall out there was, the building
It
is there
was
now,
a
was built in
church.
1850 and this was a church?
Yeah, and it closed, I think, a little after 1900. Because the Winnebago Church here was founded when the railroad went through. I think 1854 they counted. And they first met in the railroad station. And then they had a church on South Seward. It was an old-fashioned building where you went in the downstairs and the stairway was up to, the upper floor was the church. And they used that until somewhere after World War I, when they bought the Congregational building, and we'll have to mention that later. But, and then they moved into the one on Elida, and the other one was taken down and taken to Burritt, and that is the structure that, where the town hall is. Yeah. It had a fire, so it doesn't look anything like it did before. But, and I suppose it doesn't look like that because you take it all apart and you move it. Horace had a distinction. I think I've got it with me here. In the county, they had an early settlers society. And to be in it, you had to arrive here by 1840. And during the 1880s, there was a lawyer who decided he wanted to interview the people before they all died. And so sometimes he had people write their account out, and this is Horace Hudson's account. And I got some of the information out of that. Some of the copies are real bad, but you know, when they say you can copy something at the library in Rockford, you don't complain what it's like. My great-great-grandmother wrote one too, and I didn't know it. And when I said, we have the questions, do we have any answers? And he said, they're in the bread box. What's the bread box? Well, locked up somewhere, there was an actual bread box full of these papers. And he was nice enough to let me copy the ones I wanted, and I made him an index, so he had the names of the people that had written. If they were too old to write it themselves, he had the secretary type it. And those are easy to read. That was a side issue, but I thought, on your invitation, that picture, the man that's pictured is Horace Hudson.
Oh,
His farm was over somewhere near where Ralph Johnson had his, on Osborne Road. And who was it that had it earlier, before? Norm.
was it Ralph Johnson?
Yes, but
Yeah,
before that.
Can't remember offhand.
Okay. While I was going through the Hudsons, I found a connection that, Horace had a daughter named Josephine, and she married J.H. Morris. And the Morris brothers grew up on that place at Westfield Corners, where the lady left the land. They weren't her sons, but she raised them. And then he came into Winnebago and built that bungalow on Elida down this way, and had 3 daughters. One of them lived there years after, and the other one was Nell Merrifield. So it's a connection that comes on down between these families. Well, we'll mention her again when we get to that. There was a 3rd brother named Richard, and he was a county commissioner when he first arrived, before 1850. And he was born in Ohio. They must have moved from one place to another and then on. And he had a son, Dana, and you have an account, a tragic account in there, that this young man was running machinery and it caught him and beat him to death. I think you probably got it twice, because I had it in my report that you have, and then I had it loose, and I think she made it twice. Yeah, it's out of the Peck News, because Winnebago didn't have a paper yet. Shall I go on one more?
Sure.
Do you have any things from Hudson's? These are all so long ago that it's hard to relate, you know. Well, let's try Merrifields, because there are an awful lot of them, for one thing. Okay. I think we have to, the Merrifields came from Massachusetts, and the original man I've got here, Ryle J., was born in 1788, and he was a veteran of the War of 1812. And he married Mary Ann Palmer, I mentioned that before, and her father was from the Revolution. They came to Illinois in 1836, but they didn't come to here directly. They settled in New Milford Township, what we call the Kishwaukee community, where that Presbyterian church is out. That it was originally a Wesleyan church there. And they have a cemetery, and some of the people are buried there. And they almost all got married there. Some about 2 or 3 of them to Agnews, other neighboring families. And then they started to arrive here. There was a John T. from New York, and he settled in Marion Township on Kishwaukee Road. It's north of Stillman Valley, and right along the river. And he had an estate, and it shows you in the properties at the end. It was an enormous amount of land, but most of it was all that woodlot all along the river with the trees on it.
That's a lot of, is that 8,000, is that 8,000 acres?
I think so. So they had to have paid for those, you know, as they came. And Josiah, the third one, was also in Kishwaukee, but by 1860 he was over here. And they settled on that prairie land that's between Kelly Road and what's the little road? Bridgeland Road, in that area. What Miners had later was owned by one of these people too. There's a whole list of them. Abram Elston came 1850, he was here, but only listed then and then it was gone again. Riley J. eventually sold his land here and went to Missouri. Jerry, and his middle name was Ozum, was here in 1870 and 80 and then went to California. So they got the farms already and operating, and then they sold them for much more money. Then they could go farther west and buy a new setup, you know. Then there was Gurdon Norris. In 1870 he was here already, and he's the one that handed his land down to the ones we remember eventually. But there were 2 sons, Preston Russell and he married Margaret Mixa, M-I-X-A. And there's been a man to visit here from California that's his name. And he's traced back and he's from this family. And then the other son was Burton Norris. And he had a wife, Lulu Armstrong, and that was related to Robert Armstrong that had a grocery at one time, didn't he? And his daughter was Faith Armstrong that ran the Rockford Library for many years. In fact, she saved all the Winnebago paper, and they eventually gave them to us.
Wow.
Which is huge because, you know, lots of them. Eventually, Lulu lived in one of those 2 houses where the Kissicks and Andersons lived afterwards, and on Elida. But their son was Robert Norris, but he went by Norris. And he's the last one who had a farm. It was when you go down Winnebago Road and you turn east on Kelly, there was a house there. And the farm included land across the railroad. You had to cross over it. And at least once, their machinery got stuck, and they had to get the train to stop so it wouldn't wreck it. Of course, you all know that Winnebago had the first railroad. It arrived here in 1853, but that one was built in the 1880s through there. And that's when they developed Allworth Road, because there was no Allworth Road before. There was only Westfield on one side and Osborne on the other, and all the other roads went east-west instead. But in order to where they set up the station, you had to get there, so they put that extension down to Edwardsville Road. How many of you remember any of the Merrifields?
Girl,
Nora.
Minnesota, yeah.
Right, Norris and,
I was reading here, I can remember, fell down and I remember Nellie.
Oh,
yeah,
I remember Nellie too, because her husband.
Well, now-
The two daughters, Dinah and Geraldine.
eventually, it was rather tragic. Mr. Norris Merrifield fell down the basement stairs. He was 72, and he died in 1958. And Nell said, "I'm not going back there." And they sold that land to Palms, and they took the house down. I went to see her because she lived on the west side upstairs in one of those houses. And she said she told her friends to go and dig her perennials up and take them home because she wasn't going back there.
Hey, John, that farm was sold long, sold to let's get us first.
Okay,
All the-
okay, Geddes had the whole thing first. I'm sorry.
Anyway, my father-in-law's corn picker got hit on that train track.
Okay.
He used to work with Gus Merrifield. And anyway, the Word Farm on Kelly Road was bought from Jerry Merrifield
Yeah,
in 1893.
okay,
And we're still in contact with a couple of descendants.
Descendants.
Yeah. I mean, much older, I think. It was the Ellie's granddaughter and grandson.
yeah. Well, there were 3 children, and I'll run through them real fast. Geraldine graduated from Rockford High School, and she spent her life in Richmond, Virginia. And Donald was a senior when Dorothy Cash was a freshman, if you want to gauge it that way. It was, our first yearbook was made that year, and the students made the yearbooks. They had regular pictures, but then they wrote out by hand. It was a project, and so we do have copies of that. And he worked for Hormel Meat Company in Minnesota, but eventually he was their agent in Washington, Baltimore area. And the 3rd child was Nina, and she married Mr. Opal, and they were in Minnesota. And their son Craig has been here and brought me things, because he has a lot of things that they collected. One thing I forgot was the Gurdon's son Preston owned half the farm before, and when he left, he sold the part up above there. Part of it was given for the cemetery, because